Hello, Serious Survivor here. How close are we to civil war? Some predict civil war will never happen. Some people believe it's on the imminent horizon. Some may say it's already started. We're going to look at a document here that was written before the pandemic, before the civil unrest had really kicked in, and before a lot of the things that we're seeing on the press. And I think you're going to be surprised at the predictions that are made in this document, and also at the mathematical computations that we're going to look at a little bit later. We're going to look at a graphic here that was created to determine when countries were on the brink of civil war. And as odd as that may sound, it actually works. At least it's proven correct in the history. In the early 1990s, when Bill Clinton was in the White House and the United States looked unshakable, the administration appointed Jack Goldstone to study how states fell. They meant other states, not the U.S. Few expected that this model would later predict our own country's collapse. In a paper written by Professor Goldstone, who is a sociologist, and Peter Turchin, who's an expert on the mathematical modeling of historical societies, have concluded that the U.S. is headed for another civil war. The conditions for civil violence, they say, are the worst since the 19th century. In particular, the years leading up to the start of the American Civil War in 1861. The reason for this are trends that began in the 1980s with regard to inequality, selfish elites, and polarization that have crippled the ability of the U.S. government to mount an effective response to a pandemic disease, they write. So is the U.S. headed for another civil war? In a word, yes. Professor Goldstone is a leading authority on the study of revolutions and long-term social change at George Mason University. The model developed by him and Peter Turchin tracks such data as the ratio of median workers' wages to GDP per capita, life expectancy, and the number of new millionaires. It also measures political polarization or the degree of overlap between the parties. This formula was also applied to known data before the First Civil War, and it accurately predicted mathematically the 1861 Civil War and the unrest of the 1930s. 10 years ago, Professor Turchin pointed his model towards the future and made an uncannily accurate prediction. Just like in the 1850s, crisis indicators were rising, he wrote in the journal. They could be a reliable indicator of looming instability, and these look to peak in the years around 2020. And as we see this graphic here on the screen, we'll see a comparison to the First Civil War and to these modern days. What we can see is the red in the initial phases was stable during eras of good feeling, and then it begins to fall. All good things have to come to an end, right? Or at least that's what they say. And what we can see here is an exponential increase in what's called the Age of Discord 1. This is an exponential increase, and it accurately predicts civil war for the First Civil War. Now, I know this model was not around then, and that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is when the same data is applied to our current situations today, then we get what we see on the right here. We see post-war prosperity after World War II. Things really went up. And then we see things start to take a turn for the worse. When we look at the red, we can see the same type. We see an inflection point here or multiple. Then we see a sharp exponential increase in the data here. And if we look, this graph only projects out to 2020, and we can see we're still in the growing phase of this, probably around 2017, 2018, somewhere like that. And how long will it take to reach its apex? Once it reaches its apex, then this model predicts that we will be in a civil war. Does it really seem that far off now? If we look at the state of society that we're living in, and we look at the things that are going on around us, and we look at the destruction basically of the country that we grew up in, and the country that we fought for, and the country that we love, we're looking at our values being attacked. There's so much going on right now. This is not at all hard to believe. And now, mathematically, it seems to point to the same direction. And it does not appear to be a direction that any of us would really enjoy taking. The Political Stress Index, is what this is called, combines three crisis indicators: declining living standards, increasing intra-elite competition conflict, and the weakening of the state. Growing PSI indicates likelihood of political violence. The Well-Being Index indicates greater equality, greater elite consensus, and a stronger, more legitimate state. The blue was the Well-Being Index, and then the red is the Political Stress Index. Collapse happens slowly and then very suddenly. In fact, what we're seeing now was forecast as far back as 1991 in the book Revolution and Rebellion in the Early Modern World. It came down to population changes, Professor Goldstone argued. The American population surged after World War II. The boomer generation, born in a time of relative peace and plenty, and as this massive group aged and accrued wealth, they could make the country vulnerable to political crisis. But this would only happen if the elites did three things. That's tighten up the path to mobility to favor themselves and their children, like increasing the cost of university, dampen wage growth, and claim a greater share of economic gains for themselves, such as the 1%. The rich keep getting richer, while we still struggle just to make it day by day in some cases. And resist taxation, so the government is starved of needed revenues. And we see all three of these have taken place. We know that the large corporations do everything they can to get out of paying taxes, and that's been on the news, and it's been something that we've thought about and talked about for a while, how these entities are able to make millions and even billions of dollars a year and pay less in taxes than the average citizen. And as it turned out, this is exactly what would happen over the following 3 decades. At the Nonprofit Fund for Peace in Washington, D.C., the Fragile States Index tracks data such as the state of public services and income inequality and assigns countries a score indicating its resilience or ability to cope with the shocks. It's been running the index since 2000, and in the last few years, the U.S. position has steadily worsened. It was actually one of the most worsened countries in the world over the preceding several years, and indicators of group grievance and factionalized elites. These trends in the indicators have continued in recent years. Looking at other countries that have collapsed, we see a pattern of several indicators steadily worsening before a sudden shock will overwhelm the system. And quote from 4 years ago, it could be a pandemic or a loss in a war or perceived abuse by public security forces, he said. And what we're seeing right now is two of those three. We're seeing the pandemic. We are all familiar with that. We haven't actually lost a war, but right now our military power is fading with the current administration as we see growths with countries such as China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. Perceived abuse by public security forces being our police, perceived abuse by them. And normally prior to this worsening process, a country would be able to adapt to deal with that. But because of the long-term buildup of vulnerabilities, it cannot. It happens slowly and then very suddenly. Professor Goldstone also predicted the real problems will begin when Americans' $600 a week COVID-19 unemployment welfare expires. Social tensions will likely continue to grow as we move into November. The risk of violence in November are very high. November was the U.S. presidential election date, and like I had stated, these quotes are before the previous presidential election. And these quotes were based on the predictions made from scientific modeling by these researchers. And the main point is, this model accurately predicts the fall of our society. We see this unraveling in front of us every day. I'm not trying to fearmonger, but we can't ignore the obvious. The obvious is our country is falling. Mathematically, it's being predicted. And even common sense just simply tells us this. So it's very possible we are on the verge of a civil war, and the civil war would be led into by multiple conditions that we see occurring right now. We see so much going on right now that it would take hours upon hours just to formulate a list of the different problems that this nation is facing. And the real question is, what is the solution? We can label the problems, we can talk about the problems, but the solution is not so simple. And in some cases, there is no solution. How do you make someone believe something that doesn't truly exist? And on the other side, how do you change people's mind who believe something that doesn't truly exist? We've been divided for a few years now, and that division is getting worse and worse day by day. We can see it, it's evident, it's in front of us. And the quote we said earlier, collapse happens slowly and then very suddenly. We've seen the slow part of this collapse. We've seen the slow demise. And now with the cyber attacks that we're seeing, the threat of supply chain issues, the threats of grid down, all of these intertwined with that. I would expect to see this collapse go from a slow progressing event to a very sudden event. There will come a point where everyone will look around and realize the state of this nation, And I'm afraid that that point may very well come too late. I think this is in the back of a lot of people's minds. I know it is mine to a degree. And after looking at this, I'm a big math and science guy myself, but numbers don't lie. We're following the same trends that we followed in the past for every type of major disruption that this nation and the world's had. And it's pretty obvious just by looking around. And I just wanted to share this information with you. Thanks a lot for watching. God bless. And for now, Seer Survivor, out.